And if you'll join with me in our sermon reading, it's an interesting sermon reading. It's 1 Samuel 3:1, and you'll see where we're going with this as we get started. And here's what Samuel writes for us. Now the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. But this is the part we really want to get to. And in those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and there were not many visions. And I know you look at that and you say, wow, preacher, you've lost it, haven't you? What are you going to talk about today that would have anything to do with this that's applicable into our lives? But I think we're going to see where it does and where it comes in. See, we started this whole series on God is closer than you think, and I'm getting some of this from John Ortberg's book, God is Closer Than You Think. And it's really focusing on ourselves growing spiritually as we increase our capacity to experience the presence of God and an awareness of the presence of God in our lives. And last week we learned that God is always present in our lives. God desires a close relationship with us, but we have to be aware of it in order for that truth to become real within our lives and to know it. Now, my question, first one is, how many people did their homework from last week? If you were here last week, did you get your little paper, your insert? And there's more of these at the Welcome Center here if you need one. There's about 12 or 15 truths here about God wanting to have a relationship with us and be close to us. And we are supposed to read through this every day and remind ourselves that this is a reality, that God is present and active in our lives. And so I encourage you, please continue to do so. But this week we're going to talk about really a reality that I feel all of us have with our relationship with God. Sometimes God just feels so close, and sometimes God feels so far away. You ever have that in your life, anybody? Mm-hmm. We move from feeling so close to God to the question of, where are you, God? Every one of us goes through these highs and these lows. I mean, every one of us has this in our spiritual lives. We're at the top going, yay, woo, this is good, right? And then we're down the valley, not so good. And then we're up here again, then we're down here. You see, this is a part of the ebb and flow of life and of a relationship that grows with God. And so I don't want you to feel like if you don't feel like God is close to you at a certain point in time, that God is absent or missing. And we're going to see that today. Now, there are times where we feel so close to God. I think that our heads are up in the heavens so high that we start the conversation, well, God, as long as I'm in the neighborhood, we might as well talk for a while, right? Anybody ever felt that way before? It's just, whoo, it's good, you know? And then there are other times where God is just a million miles away and you don't know where God is. You know, Exodus 33, sometimes we feel like Moses in Exodus 33. Here's what it says. And God spoke to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Anybody ever felt so close like God was just sitting in a chair right beside you? Man, that was, good stuff. And other times we feel like the psalmist, like David in Psalm 13, when he cries out, how long, O Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? The highs and the lows. You know, John Ortberg likens it to the old book series, if you remember this, Where's Waldo? Anybody remember Where's Waldo? What was that, 20 years ago? Yeah, these are awesome, huh? You know, you got to find this character Waldo in these pictures that just have thousands of characters and things. You know, they're at the beach, they're at school, they're in the shopping mall, whatever it is, and you got to find Waldo. And at the beginning of the book, it's pretty easy to find Waldo because, you know, he makes it easy. By the time you get to the end of the book, it's so hard. You got to search, and it's like, you know Waldo's there, but he seems hidden. You can't find him. And sometimes in our life, I feel like that's God. It's like, God, I know you're on this page of my life in this book, but I can't find you. You're hidden somewhere in the midst of it. And it's okay. It's okay to feel close to God and to feel like God's even away from you. That's a part of life. So today as we start, I'm going to look at Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3 is a time where Moses gets his calling. It's the burning bush. We've heard this story before, right? Moses is out tending sheep. He's hanging out in the wilderness, and he looks over and he says, my goodness, there's a bush on fire, and it's not burning up. I'm going to go check this thing out. So he walks over there, and as he's walking over, God says, whoa, hold on a minute, Moses. And he calls Moses, and Moses says, here I am. He says, stop right there. Take off your sandals, because where you are is holy ground. The presence of the Lord is here. And God gives him this amazing calling as to what Moses is going to be doing throughout the rest of his life. And so he takes off his sandals and he's there with God, but he knows that God has shown up. You know, God has never spoken to me through a burning bush. You ever talked to you through a burning bush before, anybody else? No, God did that once. He hasn't done it again, really, because God's variety. But there have been times in my life that were like that burning bush experience. There have been times in my life where I knew God was speaking to me. I knew God was right there. The very presence of God was with me so powerfully that I literally felt like I need to take my shoes off. It's holy ground here. Anybody ever had those kinds of experiences? Those, I guess you would call them a burning bush experience where God was just close and you knew it? You just knew it. We enjoy those times, those mountaintops experiences. But you see, there are days where God's presence isn't quite there as well. See, when we have those mountaintop experiences, those I guess you would call them burning bush experiences, they're awesome. It's like God, you know God is present. That veil that separates the natural from the supernatural gets very thin. And these times where God shows up, and on those days, man, you want to pray. Man, you can't wait to get and pray. And when you're praying, you're thinking, you just know God's hearing you and answering. And you read the Bible, and you want to look at this, and God's literally just speaking to you through the Bible. Sin doesn't even have a temptation on you. You don't even want to be involved in that kind of stuff. You ever had those times before? Awesome. And yet, those wane, don't they? They wane. Cherish those times because we think they're going to be there forever, and yet they're not. We find these days where God seems more elusive. I got a story I want to read to you just a little bit. It's from a man. His name was St. John of the Cross. I don't know if you've ever heard of St. John of the Cross. He talks about this. He says, and he wrote this, that often when someone first becomes a Christian, God fills them with this desire to seek Him. They want to read the Scripture. They're eager to pray. They're filled with this desire to serve. And these characteristics are, in a sense, gifts from God to get them moving. A kind of, he calls it a spiritual starter kit. I kind of like that idea. But after a while, John the Cross said, this initial eagerness just wears off. See, God takes away the props so that we can begin to grow in true devotion and grow a true devotion that is strong enough to carry us even when unaided by emotions. And I think this is what we're looking at today. This idea that we can move beyond those experiences of the burning bushes to a simple walk with God and recognize that God is close no matter what is happening in our lives. Winston Churchill put it this way: mountaintops inspire leaders, but the valleys are the things that mature them. And I think that's what it is in our lives. It'd be great to have mountaintop experiences all the time. It would be great to have a burning bush experience, and God talked to me that way every day, but He doesn't. So what do I do in the midst of it? Sometimes I even get to these points of the valleys, but these valleys are the times where I learn to trust God. Those are the times where I learn to listen and to seek. And even if I can't hear God at that moment, and I don't think I can see God at that moment, I still trust and know that God is right here, leading and guiding. And this is what we're looking at today. Because whether we have a mountaintop experience and that burning bush experience, or whether we feel like God's a million miles away, we are still called to move forward in our faith. We're called to deepen our relationship with Jesus and draw closer to God. Remember when I first came here, 4 or 5 years ago? I can't even remember how long it's been now. And the first couple months, all I talked about was Matthew chapter 28. And we understood that we as the church are called for one thing. We are called to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. See, we are called to make disciples, followers of Jesus who are learning and growing and living the lifestyle of Jesus. But I said one thing with that. I said, you cannot make disciples if you are not first a disciple yourself, because you cannot give somebody what you don't have. We have got to be moving forward in those relationships of being a disciple in order to make disciples. We're going to see this next week when we talk about Mary and Martha. See, Mary sits at Jesus' feet as a disciple, and Jesus says she has chosen the right thing. But this moving forward in relationship and faith is supposed to happen whether we have the burning bush moment or whether God seems elusive and hidden. So our scripture today, 1 Samuel 3:1. See, Samuel's just received this amazing call from God. God showed up, the very presence of God. It was like a burning bush experience. God's talking to him. And he knows God is there and God is present. And he gets this calling of what he's going to do in his life. And right after this, he writes this for us. In the word those days, the word of the Lord was rare. And there weren't many visions. Kind of like Psalm 74 says the same thing. The psalmist is crying out to God and says, God, there's no miraculous things happening anymore. There are no prophets speaking your word to us. How long is this going to happen? We don't know. It's the waning days of the Judges era. Anybody know there's a book, Judges, in the Bible? A bunch of people who were leaders for the people of Israel. And some of these judges were people like Deborah. Remember, anybody ever heard of Deborah? Deborah, Gideon, Samson, these people who are leading God's people and moving them forward. And it's the waning day of these judges. And many of the things that made the people aware of God's presence and their need for dependence upon God are behind them. Things like Pharaoh is dead. The 10 Commandments were given, and everybody has a nice copy of it hanging up on their living room wall. Everybody's happy with it, all right? Manna is a thing of the past. We don't have to worry about that. We're able to make our own food now. See, all these things, Joshua and Moses, all the excitement that took place with all that, it's done. The idea of settling within the land and literally, I think, liberating and settling into the promised land is finished. And so Samuel just describes the spiritual climate of what's there. The word of the Lord was rare. I mean, tabernacle was still open for worship. Prayers and sacrifices are still being offered. God's presence, but the people are not so aware of his presence. And I think sometimes it's like that for us. See, sometimes I think it's like a cloud that covers the sun. We had sun yesterday. Everybody know that? Whew, wasn't that nice? So we had the sun. So the sun's there, and you're basking in it, and you feel the warmth, and man, it's just, it's beautiful. And then all of a sudden, the sun comes and covers it up. A cloud comes and covers up the sun. And we go, whoo, man, that sun just moved 1,000,000 miles away, didn't it? Did it? No. That sun is in the exact same spot. It's doing the exact same thing. But there's just some kind of obscuring that connection we had. See, that's what it's like with God sometimes. God hasn't moved. He's not 1,000,000 miles away. God is just as close as he ever was, but for some reason, it's just obscured. And God feels distant. And we don't always know why. And that's what we're going to look at the rest of the time here. You see, when God doesn't feel close, when we aren't having those burning bush experiences, I think it happens for one of 3 reasons. Probably happens for one of 1,000,000 reasons, but I think 3 big ones we're going to look at today, okay? The first one is, I think sometimes, just like Samuel's talking, we get into a spiritual rut. It's just kind of maintenance mode. You know, we're on spiritual autopilot and we're just doing our thing. Sometimes I think the distance is there because we hide from God. We avoid God for certain reasons, and we'll talk about that. And the third one, and this is the hard one, sometimes God just seems absent. We don't know why. We don't know why. So let's look at this first one, this kind of maintenance mode. You know, life can become quite routine. Faith can become quite routine. No major problems or setbacks, but no major gains either. We're just kind of comfortable, maybe even bored with the faith and what's there. You know, we wake up and our first response is to worry about things instead of pray about things. You know, we wake up instead of saying, man, God, you're right here with me, your presence all day long. We wake up and we start thinking about the burdens of the day and the things that have to be done. And it's different. We're unaware. Anybody ever been there, done that before? It happens. See, there's this word called habituation. And especially psychologists who deal with the study of perception talk about this. And here's what habituation means. The idea is that when a new object or stimulus is introduced into an environment, we are intensely aware of it. But that awareness fades over time. There's a decrease in response to the stimulus after a prolonged presentation. And I think the best example I could give is for anybody who's ever worn glasses or contact lenses. Anybody before? Okay. You step out and you're using, of course, you can't see very well, but you put these things on your face, and it's like, you go, I can't even imagine what this is going to be like, because all I see are these rims and these glasses, and it's horrible. 2 months later, you don't even recognize they're on your face, do you? You're like me, wandering around trying to figure out where my glasses are, and then I realize, oh, I'm wearing them. Because I don't even recognize that they're there because it just diminishes. It just over time that happens. The eagerness wears off. The awareness of God fades. God doesn't speak through burning bushes every day. And here's why. I truly believe this. I truly believe this is why God doesn't speak to us through burning bushes every day. It's because God wants us to learn to be aware of His presence in the ordinary, everyday stuff, rather than be dependent upon the extraordinary and the burning bush. What do you think about that? I say it's kind of like parents who try to teach they teach their children only to listen when they have to say their middle name. Anybody ever done that before? And it's like, Billy, pick up your clothes. Billy doesn't pay attention. Billy, pick up your clothes. Billy doesn't pay up attention. William Thomas, pick up your clothes. And then, now I have to do it, right? You see, God doesn't want it to have to be this dramatic thing all the time. He's saying, just let me say something and you be right there with me. It doesn't have to be the burning bush. It can be very simple. You know, I think about that. I think of 1 Kings 19. Elijah has just done some amazing things, and God's worked amazing things through Elijah. But now they're trying to kill him, so he runs and he hides in this cave. And God says, I'm showing up here. Come on out to meet me out of this cave. And so God shows up. Everybody ready? God shows up and he says, and the first thing that came was this amazingly powerful wind. Whoosh, whooshes through there, literally tears rocks right off the side of the mountain. But God wasn't in there. The next thing that came up was an earthquake. But God wasn't in the earthquake. The next thing that came up was fire. But God wasn't in the fire. And behind that, there was a gentle whisper. And God was there. See, sometimes we think it has to be earthquake, wind, and fire. And not to be mistaken with earth, wind, and fire for everybody over 40. It doesn't have to be. It can be a gentle whisper in the ordinary parts of life as we move forward. Anybody here in spiritual maintenance mode and a spiritual autopilot maybe right now? Saying, I'm just kind of bored with it all. I don't know. It's dangerous, and here's why. It's subtle. It's gradual. And there's just simple drifting into unawareness. It's kind of the spiritual sleepwalking. And maybe God's just trying to teach us to pay attention and stay more focused. You know, William Barry puts it this way. I love what he says. He says, perhaps our capacity to pay attention to God, like the capacity to lift weights or to speak a foreign language, only gets stronger when it is exercised. You mean I need to train myself to be thinking about God and God being with me? Yes, exercise this thing. Take this little thing out right here every day and read it and go, you know what? I think God's with me today. God's with me this week and all that's here. So how do we break free from maintenance mode? We listen, we stay focused, we do our homework, like I said, and we train ourselves to keep aware. The second one, I think sometimes God feels distance because we're hiding or avoiding. Sometimes our desire for God can be pretty selective, can't it? Maybe we are hurt by God. We feel hurt, or maybe we're angry at God, or maybe we felt let down by God, and God has just disappointed us. I wanted this thing, and it didn't happen, and so we just kind of keep our distance. Anybody ever done that before? Mm-hmm. But I think probably the biggest one is sometimes we just don't want God around because we know we're choosing to do wrong. We just flat out know it. And here he has a story by Dallas Willard. It's an interesting story about this little girl, 2.5, who grandma is watching, and she goes out to play, and she starts playing in the mud, and she called it warm chocolate that she was playing and getting it all over and everything else, and grandma was kind of facing away, so she didn't see it. She turned around and saw it. She's like, oh my goodness. So she takes her and gets her all cleaned up and says, no more playing in the mud. Okay, so what happens? She goes outside, grandma faces her to make sure she sees her, and she immediately goes out and begins to play in the mud. Anybody ever have a child or grandchild that did that? Plays in the mud. But the little girl says something very interesting to her. She says, Nana, don't look at me. Turn around, don't look at me. And she keeps saying that, and of course, grandma's a little codependent, so she kind of turns around and doesn't look at her and lets her play in the mud a little bit, like grandmas do, I know, and grandpas, I'm sure. But it was very intriguing how he says, even at such a tender young age, we understand that we don't want to be looked at when we're doing things wrong. We know it. We got the capacity to know right and wrong. And sometimes when we're going to do something wrong, we say, God, don't look at me. And we do it. Anyone here avoiding God? I mean, it's hard enough to walk in the awareness of God's presence. When we stop and purposefully try and hide from God, it makes it that much harder. Because part of growing close to God is becoming more like God in word, thought, and deed. It's about sanctification. God wants to make us holy. God wants to make us like Jesus, and in our lives, and to move forward. I'm going to show you something. It's a reminder for me. This is that's not my desk. That's not my desk either. That is my desk, okay, right there. And it took me an hour to clean it up so it even looked that good. Believe me, it's a mess. But before Kathy's dad died and passed away, he gave me this little thing. It's a glass. It's really cool. It's a couple inches thick, and it's just an etching on the back, and you see through the glass, and it's like almost 3D because of it. And it's a really neat thing to think Jesus, the good shepherd, is with me. Do you see where I keep that thing? Right at the edge of my computer. You know why? Because anytime I would step in there and think, well, today maybe I'll search for something I probably shouldn't be looking at, I look down and the first thing I see is, Jesus, you're with me, aren't you? It's a reminder. God's with me. It's a reminder that I don't get to say, God, don't look. I'm going to do this. And how many times in our lives do we sit at the computer and say, God, don't look. How many times we sit down with a group and we say we're going to get ready to gossip about somebody. We say, God, don't look or listen because we're going to. How many times in our lives has that become the prayer of our life? See, reminders in those places where we are tempted to say, God, don't look at me, is very important. Maybe you put it in your house. Maybe you put it in your car. Maybe you put it by your computer. Maybe you put it in school. Maybe you put it at work. Whatever that is, the reminder. Maybe you find an accountability partner who's going to ask you seriously every week, how is it going? Maybe you come to a study and you say, every week now I'm getting here to this study and I'm focused on God and I'm learning, and that keeps me moving forward. Here's the last one. Sometimes, are you ready? God just seems absent. Man, I can't make that thing work today. God just seems absent. How many times have you looked out and this is like you trying to find God? I don't know where God is. This is the hardest one because we don't know why sometimes God just feels far away. Times where the ceiling in the room feels like a prayer blocker. I mean, there are times where I'm praying and I can tell it just feels like my prayers don't go higher than 6 feet and they stop at that ceiling, and it's just like, I don't know what's going on. There are times where there's this burden, and I pray, God, take this thing away, and it's just there. Times where I'm praying, God, I really need to know this. Give me wisdom on this, and all I hear are chirping of crickets. Anybody ever had that before? It happens. We don't even know why sometimes. It's just there. But it's happened for thousands of years. Read through the book of Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Psalms, Job, and you'll see it's been going on for a long time. Why does it seem like sometimes God hides his face? It's like Psalm 88. Lord, I cry to you in the morning. My prayer comes before you. Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? But even in these times, we should be growing in our faith and relationship. It's called the blessing of uncertainty. How many people like to be uncertain here? Like uncertainty in your life? Anybody? Not too many, I understand. Kathy and I have completely kind of different prayer lives because I pray and pray and pray, and God will finally give me like a little piece to go in a certain direction, and I start going and that kind of thing. Kathy literally starts praying, and God answers her immediately, and it's frustrating sometimes. It is. She just prays, and God just answers her. But you know what his most popular answer is too? Are you ready here? Here it is. You don't need to know. Or you don't need to know yet. In other words, it's okay to have uncertainty. It's okay to not know. What you need to do in the midst of this time is trust me, continue to seek me, continue to do the things you know are right and what you're supposed to be doing. It'll change. You don't need to know yet. You see, uncertainty is okay, and it should be our growing time. In fact, it's such a unique opportunity that we can grow closer to God, and we can learn more about God, and we can get into a deeper relationship with God through times of uncertainty than we would have ever thought about getting to if God would have immediately given us a burning bush experience and said, here's all the answers. And sometimes God's silent and quiet, and it's okay. Because uncertainty doesn't have to bring us anxiety or fear or doubt. In fact, it's the opposite. It can help us grow and move forward. Does God seem close to you today? Anybody here having a burning bush experience? Woo, man, that's great. Go with it, man. That's awesome. God is close. Anybody else here saying, God, you're a million miles away, and I don't know why you're hiding your face from me? It's okay. In both of those situations, you know what we're called to do? Draw near to God. Anybody in a spiritual rut? Anybody avoiding God? Anybody living in uncertainty? God's calling us to seek, to listen, to trust, and to move forward. Which of these three areas do you need to work with today?